They should have confidence in the milk they consume and the cheese, and that effectively Mr. MacLeod and the creamery are on the side of the angels, produce a very, very high quality product, and effectively run to higher standards related to their retailers than effectively are required by DEFA. The whole focus, Ewan, on our report here is about the inadequacies of the DEFA department and how they're just not doing what they need to do.
So in what way are they inadequate? How are they not doing what they need to do here?
Well, you would perhaps better appreciate the concerns of the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee if you had available in front of you today, which you haven't for a couple of days, but you will, and I would draw close attention to a second report coming out from the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee on the operation of the abattoir, and both reports clearly and succinctly point to failings in DEFA. And one of the key ones, and it's highlighted in this dairy report, is that the regulator is too wrapped up with the department. And if you recall, I came back into politics at the last election saying, for goodness sake, we must restructure government. We must do two things. We must separate operations off from strategy, and we must separate off regulators from the operating departments. And we still haven't done it. And as a consequence of that, we've got these damning reports, and they're damning reports on DEFA's conduct and behaviour. And it's shocking to the committee that these things have not been addressed before now.
Well, let's look at this at a sort of a more macro level. Can you explain to our listeners exactly why there's an issue with that poacher gamekeeper? Can you give us an example of where, I suppose, in the context of the dairy issue, give us an example of where this fails the public?
Well, it's easier to outline it in terms of the abattoir report. Effectively, DEFA have said to the public and to Tynwald that the new abattoir company is an arm's length company. That's nonsense. Most of the directors of the abattoir company actually are DEFA people, and the Minister for DEFA appoints all the directors. Inside that operation, you have the regulators who also answer to DEFA, assessing the operation of the abattoir. They then produce their reports, which remain internal to the abattoir management and do not get reported properly to the board. That's disgraceful. And that's a clear, screaming example of how you must separate regulations from the departments. It's got to happen. And it'll be raised in very clear terms in Tynwald. It's got to stop, you, and it really has got to stop.
So how does politicians and how do the public demand more accountability and transparency on these issues?
Well, most members, most candidates, when they go out, they quite understandably concern themselves about how they will support the electorate, their constituents. What is rarely talked about is how the function and structure of government works, and it's this that's fundamentally at fault. And if it's sorted, it will make government more efficient and will deliver to the people of the Isle of Man better services. Right now, the government runs for itself. It does not run for those who elect it, and things must change. I've tried for years and years. I stepped down from the Council of Ministers to try to change it and to express a view contrary to what was acceptable at the time. The constituents of Douglas East were incredibly patient with me because I wouldn't talk about constituency issues. I said, please look at this fundamental issue about structure and organisation of government because that affects you, and incredibly.
Do you think that's where you've maybe struggled to bring people on board with that? Because it's a vast thing you're talking about. It affects everything. It was almost too big. It's like the sun. If you look at it, you'll hurt yourself. So you might as well look at things you can deal with.
Perhaps. I mean, I haven't succeeded. I retire out of politics not having got the message across. But I would say this, that unless this is addressed, there's going to be huge problems ahead, because it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with problems with the abattoir or the regulation of the dairy side, or whether you're talking about the fails on the promenade or problems with the ferry terminal in Liverpool, or the ridiculous failures over the harbour strategy, or the fails over the Lord Street. They're all singularly the same thing, that departments of government are messing about in areas they have not got the competence to deal with. They are their own regulators, they are their own strategists, and they're failing again and again. And it has got to change. And the next government must deal with this. Otherwise, all these issues will keep on, tumbling through the system.
Will it ever change?
It has to, Ewan, it has to change.
But if new ministers get in, they'll want the chance to have control over all these things. They'll want the chance to have a go where others have failed, and the cycle will continue.
It's foolish for us as MHKs to think that we solely and individually can solve the problems.
But some
we
do.
have to, yes, and that's a play on people's egos. What you desperately need is a certain humility to recognise that when you're dealing with big policies and big strategic issues, that we have the sense to form an organisation that can help us get to the right solutions to these issues, so that we bring in the best from outside, the best people available on the Isle of Man, and then and only then engage with the operating side of government to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing. And until we do that, we're going to carry on with these fails. We can't go on like this, I mean, the harbour strategy nonsense was Tynwald agreeing to an £80 million expenditure in round terms. Ridiculous. Look what's happened to the promenade, because it was led by an operational division. This whole thing must change. We must, I'll say it one last time on your radio programme, we must separate regulation from the operating divisions, and we must separate strategy and policy from operating divisions. And the only way to successfully do that is to form government as a single organisation, not a myriad of independent departments.
Have you got an issue in convincing the civil servants as well?
Some civil servants get it. Some politicians get it. Unfortunately, there are senior civil servants who are equally associated with their own egos and self-promotion, as is the case with certain politicians. This whole process needs to be approached from a much more humble standpoint, and a recognition that the government is there for the people and not the people there for government.
Well, just finally, I'll ask you for a blueprint then for the next House of Keys. How do they get a critical mass to go about doing what you're talking about? Is it a committee? Is it a motion? Is it a chief minister who thinks this is a good idea? How would you do it?
It's a chief minister who believes that we've had enough of all these fails, really, to understand at its very root why these fails are happening, and then to do something structurally about it. I mean, if you look at the recent reports that we've had a separation of operation from strategy in DHSC, but now DHSC is too big and clumsy at the top end. We then failed on education, and Beamans came in and looked at that. What did they do? They emphasised the importance of the operations side, but still the department at its core is still too big. Then we've had DOI. The DOI report was done by Beamans. It's been approached from the wrong perspective, and it has significant weaknesses in it, but the principle was to try to support the operating side. We need another investigation over DEFA, and so it goes on. But until you recognise the fundamental truth, which is the heart of how the government works itself, these problems will just tumble on.